atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Michael Baranowski, a professor of political science at Northern Kentucky University. I'm joined today by my conservative counterpart, Cleveland area attorney and defender of freedom, Jay Carson.
Hey, good afternoon, Mike.
Good afternoon, Jay. How's your week been? How are you doing on this Friday afternoon?
Well, I'm glad it's Friday, and I note that I take 2 weeks off to maybe catch up on a little defense of freedom work and maybe get in a little yachting before the weather turns bad and everything goes to hell. So here we are.
Everything that is, I think, an apt description of it. And before we get to everything going to hell, of course, we're going to be talking about the CR that led to McCarthy being ousted as speaker. We also want to get into the new senator from California and the new Supreme Court term, some big cases. There were oral arguments this week. Some developments in the Trump civil case, something called the Credit Card Competition Act that I'm particularly interested in. And then finally, a word or two in praise of idleness. Now, we won't get to all of that in the regular show, but whatever we don't get to in the regular show, we will discuss in our midweek supporters show. So why don't we, well, actually, before we get to it, Jay, just a correction and a comment.
You got to fix stuff up. We had all kinds of, again, in my absence.
Yeah, in more ways than one. So the correction. Last week, Ken and Trey were talking about the Alabama redistricting decision. And a couple of times Ken said Alabama is about 50% black. And someone on Facebook pointed out that doesn't seem right. And they linked to some stats. And it turns out, yes, Alabama is around 27% black. But while Ken, I know Ken was wrong in that particular. I think his larger argument was still spot on, but large or small, if we make a factual misstatement, we like to know about it. And we're always, not necessarily happy to correct it, but we definitely want to correct it and make that correction prominent and don't bury it somewhere at the back. So there's that correction.
It just shows that you're listening. It makes me feel better that people are paying attention. We throw stuff in there every once in a while just to keep people on their toes.
Why don't we go ahead and move on to the actual news? And Jay, you were right. Don't you like it when I start a sentence that way? Isn't that beautiful? But you were in fact right when you said a few weeks ago that budget negotiations wouldn't result in a government shutdown, at least, not yet. But you also, of course, predicted that Kevin McCarthy would remain Speaker of the House. And, this week.
I did predict that. Yeah.
And he lost that election this week. 8 Republicans joined all the Democrats present in voting him out. And now, of course, House Republicans have to both elect a new speaker and avert a government shutdown before the CR expires, continuing resolution expires on November 17th. And, given the fact that it took nearly a week and 15 votes to elect McCarthy back in January, this seems like a pretty big job, or 2 pretty big jobs, because the government has to be funded in not much time, just under 6 weeks. I don't even know where to start on this, Jay. There's a lot. It's your party. You can have it. But where do you want to start with all this?
Gosh. So, I guess that to some extent what I would say it would be sort of painfully obvious in that I often, argue that about Republicans that, can't anyone here play this game? And this is obviously one of those instances. There was no plan going in. This seems to be driven more by Gates's personal animus against McCarthy than by any sort of policy argument. Now he's dressed it up in things like, we want regular order. We want, build a wall, all those things, which, again, I believe me, nobody would be happier about returning to regular order than me. And in fact, that's something you'd be fine with, I think.
I'm a big regular order guy. Absolutely.
Yeah. And we can talk about what that means either later today or on a different show. But no, the fact is McCarthy has to do what, where the votes are, and you either have the votes or you don't. He he sort of set the clock running, right, when he made this deal that would allow one member to raise the issue, to call the question of the motion to vacate. Jonah Goldberg kept a briefing at MTV and then pointed out that they, 8 members wanted their MTV. Again, some are old enough to get that, some aren't. But I think this is just absolutely self-sabotage. There's nothing that Republicans are getting out of this, and we'll see what happens. I can't see. There was just no plan going in.
Well, let me
for what would happen. But go ahead.
Yeah, let me respond to that, because I expected, I would have been disappointed if you hadn't asked if there was anyone who can play this game on your side of the aisle. But I think that might not be the right question. To me, the question is, what game are they playing? And I would argue that Matt Gaetz and a few others are playing a fundamentally different game. So now, if the question is, can't these folks be team players? That's a different question, but I don't think that Matt Gaetz cares about the short-term success of the Republican Party. I think Matt Gaetz and most of those others with him care about what's going to make sense for their fundraising totals. Matt Gaetz cares what's going to make sense to line him up as a potential Florida governor in 2026 and line him up ideally as sort of a successor to the Trumpian throne, if you will, in 2028. And so I think Matt Gaetz is playing the game pretty well, given that if those are his goals. And so that to me is the answer to that question. I wanted to get your take on that. So
there was something I ran across the other day that struck me, the wisdom of Seneca, Mike, who you appreciate. And I wish I could pull it off in Latin right now, but I'll give you the translation. And something that Seneca said was, what is bad for the hive is bad for the bee. And I think there's some truth to that if you're going to sort of do something that is going to be harmful to your entire party, you as an individual bee, it's not going to benefit you all that much either. I mean, maybe he thinks it will in the long run, but I think this is bad for the party. It's bad for the brand, and I don't think at the end of the day it does much good for Matt Gaetz, because there does come a point, I think. Right. And maybe I'm wrong with this. Maybe we are living in a new era of politics where just the identity signaling and virtue signaling and stuff matters more than actual results. But at some point, you got to put W's on the board, right? I mean, you got to win something. And it's fine to say I'm more virtuous, I'm more conservative than these rhinos. But at the end of the day, if you're always losing, and this is, I think, a Trump, the Trump problem as well. He won big in 2016 and has lost since then. As a Cleveland Browns fan, I sort of get this, and it's.
Well, I don't.
You can dress up like a dog and wave the bones and bark all you like, but if at the end of the day you're still on the losing side, it pretty much sucks. And sooner or later you're going to get tired of that. You're going to drop the team or drop your quarterback.
But in the end, again, it doesn't necessarily matter, because Matt Gaetz, as Jacobs pointed out, that he's been raising a lot of money on Parler, putting out fundraising things and raising millions, and so have a number of these others. I mean, Matt Gaetz in the last cycle was the 13th highest fundraising, had the 13th highest fundraising total for Republican incumbents, and Marjorie Taylor Greene was in that group. So was Boebert. So was Jim Jordan, and so. The party can go to hell.
Of course, Jim Jordan and Marjorie Taylor Greene, though, did not join.
But my point is that that sort of rhetoric. And, John in the comments points out, well, isn't this a consequence in part of the parties being a lot weaker than what they were?
Yes. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, it is. It is a consequence of that, and decentralized fundraising, that now people can go directly through the internet and hit a bunch of people nationwide that they couldn't before. And it takes away from, there was also an interesting piece I read talking about the rebels, the Gates 8, as they call them. These other folks who were very much in debt to McCarthy and the House Republican Campaign Fund. So it's one of those. I think those folks might be hurting, and Matt Gaetz is going to be called upon to share the wealth if he wants to keep up like this, right? If he wants people to, if they're not going to get funding from the caucus, which I expect they won't, nor should they, they're going to have to start either fundraising on their own or getting it from someone like Gaetz. And I don't know how long that lasts, right? To me, sort of Gaetz could be sort of a meme stock, if you were. You know what I mean? It's one of those. He's big. Hey, look at this right now, but and he may run up some numbers for one election cycle or two. But after that, I do think people start to say, well, what's he done?
See, that's, I guess, where we differ. I don't think people ask that question anymore. I think they ask the question, whose team is he on? Is he on my team or she on my team? And what are how do I feel about them? And I guess that again gets back to your belief, which I find more and more bizarre by the day, that most people base their political decisions on some sort of rational calculation. And that to me seems more and more disconnected from any sort of political electoral reality that I can see. But yet you seem to be a desperate clinger to that.
Well, I'm looking at the general notion that people like to win, that you want your team to win. It's no fun always being in the minority. It's sort of, you get to a point of here's the thing. These folks who are giving money to Matt Gaetz, eventually at some point they're going to say, why am I sending this guy money when he's done nothing? Right? When the Democrats are still in charge, or I should say, when the Democrats take charge. This joker, could well lose the House for Republicans. And in so doing, well, that ends any investigations. That ends any, if that's just what you're in it for, right? The investigations to stick it to the other side. But not to mention that gets rid of any potential policy victories. And I do think that, it's a, you can pull some of the people some of the time type situation, right? I mean, he can, you get these folks who are demagogues, for lack of a better word, and they can have rapid rises, but they also have rapid falls.
Well, yeah.
I look how much money did Ross Perot raise second time out?
Yeah, but I understand what you're saying, but again, it seems to me that the reality of this is that it doesn't really matter to most voters. I think it's largely, we're all focused on it, but it's mostly inside baseball stuff. And that's the beauty of the overall plan is if you do keep on losing, you say, see, isn't that just more proof that the system is rigged against us? They're cheating. That's why we're losing. We have the right message. I'm in there fighting for you. Look around. You and everyone you know believes in what I do. You and everyone you know voted the right way. How is it even conceivable that we lost?
If I'm running a primary against Matt Gaetz, I'm going to say, look, this guy voted with the entire Democratic caucus. That's where he is. Every Democrat in the House Nancy Pelosi. I mean, I'm trying to think of the entire squad, every last one of them voted for Matt Gaetz's proposal. And what does that tell you about what they think, what the other side thinks?
But the counter argument, to that, in his district that he won by with something like 67% of the vote is I am the real conservative, the real Republican, and Donald Trump will tell you so. And boom.
I'm not entirely sure that Donald Trump will tell you so anymore, though.
Oh, Donald Trump and Matt Gaetz. I mean, Matt Gaetz is, they're pretty. Matt Gaetz has been very smartly using Donald Trump, and as long as Donald Trump is relevant, Matt Gaetz will continue to use Donald Trump by playing to his ego, which is the one thing that Donald Trump certainly, not necessarily a man of great restraint, cannot restrain himself from responding to. And so,
but I would point out though there were a lot of Trumpian Republicans. I'm thinking Max Miller from Ohio, who took over the it's the Friday afternoon. I'm losing the name. Former Cincinnati Bengal football player.
Oh yeah, I know what you mean.
Seat who got ousted for voting to impeach Trump. And then Max Miller, who came in as extremely Trumpy, and some other folks who rode the Trump bandwagon and who were saying they would eject Gaetz and the others from the caucus or the Republican conference. So I think that's telling.
So I guess in the end, where we're at,
the fact that look, there's 8 of them, 8 out of whatever 200. I think there's 224 who voted the other way. That's it's bad when you have a small minority or a slim minority and 8 people can tank you, but that's the numbers are what they are. But still, it's not a testament to say, is this a deep schism? And in fact, the break isn't between the mainstream old school Republicans and Trump. It's now between the Trumpians and the Gaetzians. So I mean, I think this is a schism within a schism, and this is a minority of a minority. I mean, even again, most of the Freedom Caucus is sort of disowning Gaetz, and I think rightly so.
It seems that to me that you're assuming that this is going to hurt Republicans electorally, and I don't know that I agree with that. That certainly seems to be the conventional wisdom on both sides of the aisle. But sometimes I think Washington forgets that the world outside the Beltway, the non-political junkie world, again, doesn't pay a whole lot of attention. And we'll see this just as Washington being a big friggin' mess. We need to drain this particular swamp. And then in the end, unless it results in an extended government shutdown that people really feel the consequences of, I don't think this hurts the Republican Party that much. What do you think?
No, but I think it affects Republican primary voters who are watching, right? And maybe they're not political junkies, but they tend to be sort of involved, and they're looking at this and saying, "Listen, we've got a majority, slim majority, and we're completely squandering it. We could, in fact, have blown it here, right?" And the fact that all of the Democrats voted in lockstep for chaos sort of tells us, what the how the rest of the world's viewing this. I don't know that it's not like they're going to be a Gaetzian challenger to a lot of folks in primaries. And I think this is, so that's that, and I think that's your first audience, right? I think there will be challengers to those 8 folks, and I would hope that one of that those challengers are well funded.
Yeah, I think you're generally wrong about all of that, and we will certainly see. But again, to me, that totally makes sense in the if the Republican Party is more or less what you would like it to be, and what honestly I would like.
Well, my goal is to win a majority, and then to be able to enact some sort of Republican policy, or at the least, this tends to be my view more often than not. There was a great state legislator I knew, Mike. It was a great man, Representative Jim Beakey. He's still around, but one of his great stories was one year one of his opponents criticized him, saying, Beakey's been in the Ohio House for 3 terms now. He's only introduced 5 bills. And at which point Beakey responded and said, "Bills? Hell, I play defense." And I think that's the way I look at it, and I think that's the way a lot of Republicans look at it.
Well, okay. The first part of that is certainly true, and I've known you for a long time. Absolutely. But the second part of that, again, I almost on a weekly basis, Jay, I feel that you're sort of drifting. You're on this little ice floe. You're a sad little penguin on an ice floe with the bulk of the party. I guess you're drifting away from it, or it's drifting away. There's drifting going on, and you seem to have some kind of reverse binoculars or some kind of glasses on, saying, "Oh no, they're not really that. For there are more people here with me, right, guys? You're with me. You're with me." And one day, I think you're going to wake up, become enlightened. Sadly, I hope I'm wrong about all this.
Well, no, I'm not arguing that. This Republican Party is not the Republican Party that you and I, grew up with. But I am arguing that 220 some people voted to keep McCarthy, and 8 voted against him.
Yeah, that's
not an insignificant number, and many of those 224 were far right. You might even call them MAGA extremists. So that's what I'm. My point is, look, those are the numbers to some extent, but for the unfortunate concession that McCarthy made when he got the job, this wouldn't have happened.
I think that's a good point.
That's why
that's a good point.
I take a little different view.
That's a good point. Actually, I'm glad you brought that up. I'm also glad you brought up the point about the unfortunate concession that McCarthy made in his desperate, super extra thirsty desire to have the speaker's gavel, right? Which was a really stupid move. And this was, some people would say, why didn't this happen with the squad under the Democrats and Pelosi? Well, because the rule to vacate
they weren't dumb enough to, they knew how to play the game.
So there you go. Yeah, I think that was a horrible concession. And it sounds like now there are certain centrist Republicans who are saying, listen, if you want our support, or before we even vote on this, we should get some rules change in place saying that a motion to vacate the chair will require a majority of the conference or some sort of larger number. But I don't know that that's going to happen. I would be surprised if that happened. But what do you think about that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that should be the sine qua non. That's some Latin for you. That any aspiring speaker should ask for, because anything else is just unworkable, right? And this has proven that. And I don't know what good it would be to become a speaker in such an unworkable situation, when you'd be subject to summary removal again. So I just don't see anyone agreeing to it. And I think even the 8 folks, and here's the thing, 8 folks can't block the vote for speaker. I don't think, we'll see, unless the Democrats are going to play that they will forever, vote with Gates, which I think that becomes dangerous for them at some point. But at some point you just can't proceed without a speaker any longer, and the pressure will build on those folks to vote for someone. And it's for example, I think it's a tough argument for any of these 8 folks, going back to the district and facing voters to say, well, look, what's wrong with Jim Jordan? You're telling me he's not conservative enough? I think that's a losing argument. And at that point, they start to, you start to see them for what they are.
Well, I think that analysis is wrong on a lot of levels.
Jeez.
Yeah. Well,
I just can't. All right.
Call them like I see them, Jay. I think it's wrong because, number one, I don't think that either of the 2 top candidates right now for the job, Jordan or Scalise, I don't think that either of them will insist on changing that rule. I think both of them will say, certainly Jordan and probably Scalise will say, no, that's fine. And number 2, I think that absolutely the Freedom Caucus will certainly support Jordan, I would expect, given he's a co-founder of it. But also I would expect Scalise, the problem is getting essentially almost the entirety of the Republican caucus. I mean, I think that is going to be the challenge. And it sounded to me almost like maybe I misheard you. You weren't suggesting that you would expect in some way Democrats to vote for a Republican for Speaker. I mean, they're all going to vote for Jeffries, and that's as it should be, I would expect.
Yes and no. I think after so many votes, no. I mean, I've seen this happen like 3 times in Ohio in the last I don't know how many years. At some points they would say enough is enough, because at some point then Democrats get blamed for the chaos as well.
I don't think that's right at all. I think that the Republicans have a majority. It's the majority's job to coalesce behind the speaker. And the idea that the other team would vote for one of your team's guys for the sake of the institution, that's ridiculous. I think you would, if it were reversed, you wouldn't have Republicans voting for.
It gets tough to keep arguing that, nothing's getting done and the institution's broken and so forth. And, we need to avert a shutdown.
Okay, well, have 5 Republicans vote for Jeffries. That works too.
Yeah, and
I'm okay with that.
I'm not saying that outcome is impossible.
Yeah, I think that outcome is.
I think it's unlikely.
No, it's impossible.
But it's not impossible.
Well, but it's not theoretically impossible. No, I mean, Yeah. But I don't. Let's talk about.
No. I think there's a very much a non-zero risk that this whole little stunt could end up making Jeffrey Speaker.
I think that the risk may be non-zero, but it is something like 0.00, add a few more zeros, and then throw a 1 in there somewhere. But I
don't think it's that low.
Okay, but do you have a sense of who might end up with this? If it's let's assume it is actually a Republican who ends up as Speaker, Scalise or Jordan. Someone else?
I think Jordan is probably best positioned.
It doesn't seem to me, based on what we've seen from Jim Jordan, temperamentally, that he's the sort of person who is temperamentally well suited to do the job of Speaker. What do you think?
Oh, I think he is. I think it's sort of he's got. I think he might rather have the job that he's got, right? Of being the judiciary bulldog kind of thing. But no, temperamentally, I think he could do the job. It's just not the role he's traditionally played. I think Scalise could do the job too. And again, I'm just saying, if you're asking me who do I think is better positioned to get those votes, I think it's probably Jordan.
Okay. And I guess if that's the case, let's say that Jordan ends up as the Speaker. I would tend to agree that anything could happen at this point, but if I had to bet, I would bet a very small amount on Jordan.
Who would you bet on then?
I said I'd bet a very small amount on Jordan. I wouldn't bet more than a small amount on anyone, but I'd bet maybe
okay. I was anticipating you would bet more heavily on someone else. No. Okay.
Not on this. I think
he would still. You still see him as the front runner, but you would throw this into it like anything can happen.
Yeah, basically, exactly. So, to me, that brings up the question of Ukraine, because Jim Jordan is one of the more anti-Ukraine folks in the House Republican caucus. The group Republicans for Ukraine has given him an F on Ukraine votes. He's voted against all but one Ukraine measure in the House. And he said many things, making it very clear he is not at all interested in sending any more money to Ukraine. And as Speaker, of course, he would have a great deal of power in deciding what gets on the floor and what doesn't. Essentially, almost full power. There are discharge petitions, but it's not really, it's more a thing in theory. Than
when has that ever really happened? Yeah.
And that brings me then to the Ukraine question. If what we both think is most likely in a chaotic environment where anything can happen does in fact happen, that seems to suggest that Ukraine aid is dead.
I wouldn't say dead. I think it'll continue. And again, you know where I am on Ukraine. I am the last Cold Warrior, I suppose. I shouldn't say that. I mean, there are a lot of other Republicans. I think there are that group Republicans for aid to Ukraine. No, I think Jordan is, you know, it's sort of, it plays well for a while, right? It's easier to be in the minority. And to be clear, House Republicans, even if they hold the majority, they're still in one sense in the minority in that they don't control the White House or the Senate. So there's that sense of, like we talk about sometimes, free votes, or being sort of the backbenchers who can just kind of throw bombs, knowing that you don't actually have to really be responsible for governance. I think that might, I think it'll continue, right, the way it's been. So there's been, pushback before in the House about Ukraine aid, but it still happens. Now, again, my preference, and you can say, well, this is out of step with the rest of the current Republican Party, but hell, I'm the guy who's on the show, so I think the better argument is, if you're worried about China, let's make sure that the Russians lose in Ukraine. I think that's the big message sender. I think the response should be, Joe Biden should have acted quicker in Ukraine and needs to do more right now and stop dragging our feet, and let's have a real policy that what we want to see is freedom for the Ukrainian people and all the Russians expelled. That would be, I think you can make that as a good selling point. You can make the argument of, if we're saying our ammunition is low, our factories are not putting it out enough. Well, let's redouble our efforts. Let's get American jobs, people building planes, tanks, rebuild our military, and rebuild our ability to project that power, not only through our military, but through selling and loaning and providing aid to others who need it. I think you're right. I think that's a winning message.
I think you're right. Not that it's a winning message, but earlier that's very out of touch with a lot of Republican voters and their sort of nativism and isolationism and that sort of unfortunate tendency that you do not share, of course. But I think a more likely outcome is that these Republicans who really don't care about Ukraine either way, unless it affects their personal political fortunes, because that's the sort of people they are. That's the system we've set up to basically elect a bunch of, I say a disproportionate number of narcissistic psychopaths in both parties. And so that's what you get when you get government by psychopath, I think. And, but I think an argument can be made for tying Ukraine aid to border security or border troops. And I think if there is going to be a compromise, it's not going to be based on principles of any sort. It's going to be based on that sort of hardball. We'd really like more people at the border to ideally harass. And hey, if we could, shoot a few brown people, that's good too.
Whoa, come on. I think you're underselling the problem that we have at the border.
Oh no, we definitely have a problem at the border.
Right.
Yeah. But there are.
Yeah. And there needs to be, again, in the Biden administration, actually, Mayorkas is taking some extraordinary steps to erect, as he calls, physical barriers, which I think that's what I made the argument for a while back. It's not a wall; it's just a physical barrier in certain places. So, I think that's fine, and I think the government can walk and chew gum at the same time. And to me, as a Republican, traditional Republican, I would say those are both things where the government ought to be involved and ought to spend money, right? I mean, if the general gist of my philosophy, and I think again you could say this traditional Republican philosophy, is that to the extent the government spends money and does things, it ought to spend money and do things that people can't reasonably be expected to do themselves. And protecting the border and foreign policy are two of the big ones.
Yeah.
So.
One thing on this that didn't occur to either of us. But,
one more thing before I forget, though. I do think there also would be. This is an area where there are enough Republicans who do support aid to Ukraine that you could have bipartisan crossover.
I think that's a possibility.
And your argument would be, well, Jordan just never brings that bill to the floor. I think he does, like you said, if there's something else in it. So
I think it's possible, but I think something that neither of us raised that actually both Jack B. and John did on Zoom here just now is, what about the not insignificant number of Republicans or Republicans in the electorate, not necessarily in Congress, who see all this as Ukraine is a whole big part of the Biden crime family corruption thing. And so therefore any aid to Ukraine is essentially basically giving a pass or helping out the Biden crime family and a move against Donald Trump, who tried to shut that whole thing down. And I think that is something to be considered because there are a non-trivial number of people who seem to have some beliefs along those lines. Yeah,
I think there's probably something to that. The fact that of the Biden involvement in Ukraine would seem to that's just kind of like another strike against it, right? If you were going to say, look, this is just a matter of why are we getting involved in this war that by some say we don't have any real dog in the fight or any national interest there. And again, that's something I disagree with vehemently. And then, plus this is this place that, Biden kid got rich off of, and it's corrupt, and it is. But I think that the test of whether you come to the aid of another country isn't so much on whether they're corrupt, but you look at bigger geopolitical picture. Chiang Kai-shek was corrupt as hell. As was Ferdinand Marcos, as was a whole lot of other.
We support all kinds of corrupt regimes. We have it's an American tradition.
No, yes. I'm arguing almost for a Kissingerian amorality, right? That in foreign policy, but at the same time, I think you could argue that there is something, even if they're corrupt, that doesn't mean that they ought to just get invaded by Vladimir Putin.
All right. Well, and the final question, I guess, on this before we move on is, I said at the opening of this extended discussion that you were right about there being brinksmanship, but no shutdown. Are you going to predict? Are you going to stick with that prediction for come November 17th? I believe it is. Do you think we're going to have a shutdown now in this environment, or what do you think?
I think we will have a speaker before then, and I think a shutdown will be averted. Okay.
Well, I agree with you that we'll have a speaker before then, but I do not think a shutdown will be averted, but I do not think it will be an extended shutdown. And I'll say I don't think it'll go for more than 2 or 3 weeks. That'll be my prediction. And we'll see. All right, let's move on to something else. There is something else that happened.
What else you got?
Well, there's a new senator in California. Governor Newsom appointed LaFonza Butler to fill the remainder of Dianne Feinstein's term. And of course, Butler is now she's a senator of Emily's List, and they work to elect pro-choice, my God, pro-choice Democratic women. She was also an advisor to Vice President Harris's 2020 presidential campaign. She's the only Black woman in the Senate right now. the third black female senator in U.S. history, and she's one of two openly lesbian U.S. senators right now, the other one being
She's got it all going for her.
Yeah. And
that checks all the boxes.
Well, I thought you'd say that, and it sounds like there's a tone there, Jay. Why don't you talk about that a little bit?
Well, I think I might argue that doing this demographic box checking is not a way to electoral success or good government. Now, the electoral success piece might not matter so much in California, although I wouldn't be surprised that she sees primaries. We'll see how this goes, but I think you can look at the Kamala Harris ascendancy and see how that worked out.
Well, and this gets a lot more into, I think, California Democrat inside politics sort of thing. And so, for instance, right now, in the race to replace Feinstein permanently, you've got Adam Schiff and Katie Porter, who are both sort of out ahead. Barbara Lee is really sort of struggling, and there's some stuff going on between Lee and Newsom, and a lot of people wanted Newsom to endorse Lee, and that would have helped her campaign. But I also point out that Lee is 77 years old, Butler is 44 years old. That might have, and I think also if you're Gavin Newsom looking at a potential presidential bid in 2028, you're thinking, hey, how would it help me out in the primaries to have, if I'm a white male, which, unless some weird things happen, he's going to be a white male in 2028 as well. How would it be to have a black female lesbian VP running mate? Well, that might look really good in the primaries for me as a white male.
Sure.
And so I think there's a lot of table setting, potentially at least, going on for the future. And like you said, California Senate, that's a safe seat for the Democrats. They don't really have to worry about that. Butler hasn't even announced if she's going to run or not. I expect she will. Who
would not? Yes. Who would ever say, yeah, I'm just filling in in the world's greatest deliberative body, and then I'm stepping aside.
Yeah. Well, and then the weird thing is basically there are going to be two elections in California. Then the voters are going to be asked to vote for who's going to fill the rest of Feinstein's term, that 2 months between the election and the new Congress, and then also who's going to fill the full 6-year term, which is up in 2024 as well. And so presumably they'll pick the same person for both, because it'd be weird to say, well, I think, Butler's fine for a couple months, but I want Schiff for 6 years. That would be kind of a strange thing, but kind of a weird quirk of election law there. So yeah, I mean, I don't think it seems to me to be a reasonable choice. Some people were making hay of the fact that, she's currently residing or was currently residing in Maryland or something like that. But
there's something to that. I mean,
she's got a residence in California.
They do ask you. There's, residency is one of the requirements, and come on, you'd hope that wouldn't be that tough to.
But of late, on both sides, that certainly has been a flexible requirement as long as you have a home there. And actually, I should point out, unlike, say, a Dr. Oz thing, she does have longstanding deep ties to California politics and in the state. So it's not like she's some carpetbagger or anything like that. And as John pointed out, Emily's List raises a lot of money for Democrats. And so having someone who's tied into those fundraising networks and those constituencies, that's putting them in a position of political power. That's not a bad move for the Democrats. So all in all, seems like a reasonable pick. Though I got to say, when I look at Newsom 2028, I don't really see him as one of the strongest Democratic candidates. He's desperate for the job, I would think. But for me, thinking about general elections, I think Democrats would be better to find some sort of a strong swing state governor, ideally not a white male. You got Katie Hobbs in Arizona, Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan, maybe even Tammy Baldwin, right? She's not a governor, she's a senator, but still, there are some better choices, I think, than Gavin Newsom. It doesn't really bring you anything because California is an automatic.
Right. That was what I was going to say. It doesn't get you anything extra.
But if you have run Tammy Baldwin,
as like say a Michigan would.
Yeah, if you can get Baldwin or Whitmer, say, well, we can deliver Michigan or Wisconsin possibly. Well, that's that's not a bad thing. So anyway, we shall.
So I would say again, this is way far out, and again, out of my. As far as you say, I'm out of touch with the Republican Party, so I'm even more out of touch with the Democratic Party. But I think Whitmer would have just better skills, right, than what I've seen from Baldwin. I think she could be a disaster on the campaign trail. But
Whitmer certainly having those in terms of governing skills, and a governor, I think, just generally might be better suited for actually doing the job. But if you're talking about campaigning,
always better than and there's just always the issue of when you try to run for president or vice president from the Senate, it tends to be tougher sledding than those people expect. Despite it being that sort of an iron rule of this is how it's always been and always will be. Everyone thinks this time will be different. Yeah.
For me, right? Because I am special. Yes, absolutely. Generally, they're not. Well, I think we have time for one more segment, and I really wanted to get to this because I'm always excited about the first Monday in October, and I assume you are too, probably.
Oh yes, Supreme Court. Yeah.
That's right, the Supreme Court. It's not just a movie starring Walter Matthau from the 70s or something like that. There was a movie anyway. I don't know where that came to me, but yes, it is the start of their new term. Always the first Monday in October. I guess they run the term generally runs.
I might be going to oral arguments at the end of the month.
Oh, very cool. Well, that would be.
Yeah, might be. Don't know yet. Haven't fully decided. Haven't booked the trip, but. As a member of the Supreme Court bar, one of the things I get is I can get admission to oral arguments.
Do you get discounts on popcorn
and one guest?
Yeah,
exactly, and 10% off at the gift shop. So
very cool.
I got that going for me.
Awesome. Well, and oral arguments can be very interesting to listen to, even just recorded. And so you'll have to talk about that. But there were a couple of cases that I did have oral arguments in this week. I wanted to get to at least one of them, which is like a weird little technical thing, but can have some huge real life implications. And the case I'm talking about is Pulsifer versus United States. It involves mandatory minimum sentences. And at first, when I read this, and I read the document, it said the question presented to the court is, and I am not kidding, folks, whether the word "and" in a statute means "and," or if it might actually mean "or." And I read that and I thought, huh? And that's kind of what, and then Justice Alito said at one point, the people here who haven't studied the case must think this is gibberish. And I was like, I hadn't studied the case at that point. And I was like, yeah, that sounds about right. Because I'm pretty sure "and" means "and," not "or." But when I had a little time to actually read the statute, and also to think about the decisions from both the Seventh and Eighth Circuits, they both concluded that "and" in this case means "or," whereas the Ninth Circuit
they're no slouches.
Yeah. Now the Ninth Circuit, which I'm a big fan, they said "and" means "and," and
they're tremendous slouches. Yeah.
So yeah, it seemed really weird, and I had a conversation with a judge friend who kind of enlightened me about a few things as well. Listener to the show, hi if you're listening. Hope you are. But it made me rethink it, and maybe it wasn't gibberish. And here's what I mean. So the case, let me back up, involves criteria.
Yeah, you kind of have to walk through the statute as to why it might be different. Yeah, because of the usage. Yeah.
So the question involves criteria listed in what's called the First Step Act of 2018. And this was a bipartisan law that allowed judges to basically ignore mandatory minimum sentences in certain instances based on the defendant's criminal history. And there were 3 of these conditions that are listed at one point: the total number of criminal history points, which can't exceed 4. You can't have a prior 3-point criminal offense. And it said you can't have a prior 2-point violent offense. Now, the Seventh and the Eighth Circuits both concluded that, well, if you read the conditions in context, that "and" there between the second and the third condition doesn't make sense. And so the sensible reading of it would be "or." But on the other hand, there was a dissenting judge in the Seventh Circuit decision who said, wait a second, the Supreme Court before has said that courts shouldn't just construe statutes to conform to what we might think Congress meant.
What makes sense.
Yeah. And then she further said, and I'll quote it here, courts must follow statutory language even if they think that the results would be absurd or wildly out of proportion to the goals that Congress has articulated. And I got to say, Jay, I found myself torn because it seems to me this is almost certainly an issue of what I'm told is called, oftentimes in legal terms, Scrivener's error, where they meant to put in or and was put in. This could have serious, real life, years in prison consequences, not just for this Pulsifer guy, but for a lot of folks.
Tens of thousands of people. Actually,
This is a big deal. And so if there's ever a condition where the court should say, you know what, we're going to ignore what Congress did say, and we're going to go with what we're pretty sure they meant, this would be it. And so, again, I'm very torn. What do you think?
So, wow. And I'm looking at the statute right now, even as we speak. And it is, as it's phrased right now, to read it as and would be seemingly nonsensical. Just because you would have, you have to have, I mean, again, it just doesn't make sense, because to have all of these would be a really,
and yet, what's the limiting factor here? Do we say, well, we know it when we see it, and if it's like really nonsensical, but if it's like really doesn't quite seem to make sense, then do we say we can insert our meaning? You see, I mean that's why. I
get it. It should, and or would definitely be much clearer.
Because if you're, I think
it should. The better way to say this would have been right. The exception is, this, here are the exceptions if you qualify for one of these.
And I would think the standard conservative,
and then the exceptions, and you would have an and then that would make perfect sense. But that's not exactly what the statute does.
But I would think the standard sort of strict constructionist response would be, okay, Congress should go ahead and just amend this to change that. It would be a quick and easy fix. Go ahead and do that. Boom, taken care of.
Yeah. So I would say there is, though, the principle of statutory construction that you shouldn't construe a statute to a result that's nonsensical. And there is precedent for correcting Scrivener's errors. And I think you could probably draw upon other canons of statutory interpretation. And there's a whole bunch of them, and some of them contradict one another. But to look at, one is this. First, I think it's ambiguous what Congress meant, and then you get into this construction piece. So, yeah, to me, this might be one of those. Just you call it that. This just can't be right. We're going to treat it as or.
And so, do you think that will get? I can't imagine that'll get a unanimous court. I would think that Alito and Thomas wouldn't go along with that. Scalia might not either. But I mean, what are you sensing? Like a 6-3?
I don't know. No, I think it might be a little different because I think this might be. I kind of like. There might be room to write an opinion saying why this is different than other. Reading the textualist approaches, and that meaning that look, the text has to make sense at some point. I think there's probably room, right? This is probably one of those where you would get a so-called kind of like we talked about free votes, kind of a free dissent, right? If you know that it's going to get worked out the right way anyway, you could still write a really good dissent about textualism.
Now you're the attorney.
So and again, I'm going to admit that I have not dug in a whole lot on this case with this issue, but that would be my guess.
Yeah, because to me, when I read the statute, and I have it pulled up here as well, is I wouldn't call it nonsensical. I would say it would make more sense if it were written with an with an or before an and without getting too deep in the weeds, I could say, well, no, it can be reasonable to construe. Yeah, the Pulsifer is getting screwed here, but to construe this as saying that no, that it's reasonable to assume that Congress meant you shouldn't have more than 4 criminal history points. You can't, and that includes you can't have even a single 3-point offense, and also you can't have a 2-point violent offense. And the word violent to me is what maybe makes it a little bit different and makes it go from being nonsensical, which I don't think it is, to being less sensical than it would be with an or, if you see what I mean.
Yeah. And that should be a word, less sensical.
And for people who don't have the statute in front of them, this is probably fairly gibberishy as well. So at this point, maybe we move on. I don't know, but it was just fascinating me. But before we do go, I want to talk a little bit, just briefly, about Donald Trump's civil case. Last week, Trey and Ken discussed the Trump civil fraud case, which started that week. And of course, that's the case in which New York's Attorney General, Letitia James, has accused Trump, his kids, not all of them, Barron, I think it's not part of this whole thing, but
partisan witch hunt, Mike.
Exactly. Yeah. The partisan witch hunt of inflating property values by up to somewhere over $2 billion to get favorable terms for banks and insurers. And we're not going to rehash that, but this week, the judge hearing the case, Arthur Edgernon, I don't know. I'm sorry about that, Art, if you're listening. But anyway, the judge ordered all parties to not speak publicly about any members of the court staff after Trump posted on Truth Social attacking his clerk, posting a picture of the clerk together with the caption, "Schumer's girlfriend, I won't say her name, is running this case against me. How disgraceful. This case should be dismissed immediately." And then Trump's campaign email blasted the post to subscribers, presumably raising a bunch of money off it, that sort of thing. What's your take on the partial gag order and what Donald Trump did there?
So, one, what he I guess it gets into the 2 different questions, right? One is that the appropriate way to handle this? Absolutely not. Is it protected First Amendment speech? Perhaps. I would tend to think at this point, I think the gag order is appropriate. I think it's, I think there was a difference after the trial, right? To say, oh, that was, it was all fixed and the law clerk was against me and all that kind of stuff. Again, it doesn't condone that because I don't think that's appropriate conduct. But I think it's protected speech. I think you could make the argument that during the pendency of the case, that type of speech, the interest in having an actual legit judicial proceeding free from political influence outweighs the interest in being able to speak immediately or make opinion statements about court personnel.
And I would expect, just generally speaking, your view of Donald Trump presumably being sent the picture of the clerk with a Schumer and then just making up out of whole cloth the accusation that she's dating him and that she's throwing the case, that she's crooked. That is sort of a despicable kind of thing to do.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
I like to get you on record about that so listeners can actually hear that.
No. I mean, here's the thing. Quite honestly, I think I'm pretty consistent on those type of issues in terms of, and if, let's put it this way, if a lawyer did it, it would be not only despicable, I think it would be sanctionable. But Trump arguably has the First Amendment right to say despicable things because the stuff that isn't despicable usually doesn't come under fire. So I'm looking at this is there a short term when you're weighing the limitations that the courts has placed, is it? I think it passes First Amendment muster at this point. I think a order afterwards would not, but I would expect that's coming anyway. But
now, presumably,
and none of this changes my despicable opinion that the case is despicable and is just sort of a partisan hit job, right? This is of course the case where no one has alleged that they were defrauded. No one's lost any money. There are no victims.
Well, wait a second. Two separate things here. It seems to me that as a matter of,
but I'm trying to make that clear.
As a matter of fact, it has been at least ruled, right, that Donald Trump did in fact commit fraud, but that nobody lost anything from that fraud. At least no one has come forward to say it. So I just want to point out that
I would say one of the legal elements of fraud is that there's some loss occurred.
Gotcha. Okay, so that let me rephrase then. No one, I think, outside of that,
and maybe perhaps under the specific New York statute they're talking about, maybe I could be wrong, but I'm just saying, typically, fraud is a no harm, no foul type situation.
Gotcha. So I'll rephrase saying, I think a lot of people agree that Donald Trump did in fact inflate these values for whatever reason, but that does not necessarily constitute fraud if there is no harm done in that sense.
Exactly. Yeah. If no one complains and no one loses money, I think you've got two arguments there. One, does it legally constitute fraud under whatever statute they're prosecuting them there, and the second is the political argument of, is this the best use of the people's resources?
And you and I have talked about that before, and we're more in agreement, I would say, than disagreement on a lot of elements of that one. Another thing that occurred to me in reading the statement, I'm wondering if the judge's clerk actually might have a defamation case against Donald Trump. What do you think? I mean, he claimed that she's running or ruining. I have running here, but who knows? It could have been a typo. I don't know, but running the case, that she's.
Well, if she's running the case, I mean, I think you could. I don't think
running,
that's defamatory.
Being a clerk, right?
Yeah, you're sort of, because as a clerk, oftentimes they're the folks who are in charge of sort of setting, keeping the deadlines and that kind of stuff, and doing a lot of the administrative behind the scenes stuff. So
what about
running the case could be not.
Well, what about
ruining the case?
The quote taken in context, the Schumer's girlfriend thing clearly intended to question her her impartiality, her ethics. That's because she calls it a disgrace. It should be dismissed and that sort of thing. It seems to me that if I understand it correctly, if that was a statement that both harms her in some material way, ruins her reputation, she suffers some damages from that, and that was a statement that he made that was either false or he made with reckless disregard for the truth.
Reckless disregard for its truth. Yes.
Reckless disregard for the truth. That's Donald Trump's whole MO. I mean,
Right.
There is a defamation case there, isn't there? I mean, at least on the face
so there's two sort of types of defamation, and again, I don't want to dig too deep even in New York law but this is just generally, right? And one is that type of a false statement, and if it's made with and there's actual damages. Others are statements that are defamation per se, right? That the statement in itself is not only false, but it's so outrageous and malicious that you don't actually have to show actual damages. So then the interesting question to me is being accused of dating Chuck Schumer defaming per se? I don't know. I mean, it's sort of, I would think so.
Well, see, I would think that it's not so much that, but that if you read the text in context, it's queer.
Right. It's saying she is compromised. She is not following her principles. She is acting unethically because of her alleged relationship with Schumer. I was sort of joking about.
Oh, okay.
Dating Chuck Schumer, I would think certainly should be defamatory.
Gotcha.
Per se.
Okay.
But
I don't think that there would be a case. I don't think that the clerk would necessarily want to bring the case because that brings its own issues, certainly. But in any case, that just occurred to me, and I wanted to get your thoughts.
Well, and again, it does get to the point of though, you could perhaps get some statute or exemplary damages, right, on that kind of case, but they wouldn't be a lot. It's usually, it's just kind of, all right, well, $1,000 if you can't prove that, have some actual damages that flow from it.
Then if it's a case where Trump supporters, the millions of Trump supporters who saw that, then people start making threats against her family. I
got to get a new security system. I've got all this. I had to go to therapy. All that. Yeah, those would be damages that you could you could claim.
And let's hope that it doesn't. Yeah, let's hope that it doesn't get to that level for sure. But yeah. All right. Well, on that note, why don't we close for this week? We did not get to. I cannot believe this. We'll have to do this on the midweek show, Jay, but we did not get to talk about my favorite federal government agency. You know what it is.
At least for now, Mike.
Yeah, that's true. The Consumer and Financial
Appreciate them while you got them.
Yeah, that's that. You guys keep on trying to kill it. We're going to talk about that latest attempt to do so. Also, we want to talk about the Credit Card Competition Act, which we didn't get to, and maybe a little bit in praise of idleness. All that we will get to on the midweek show for supporters. And if you're not already a supporter, we do hope you'll consider becoming one, because without supporters, no way we'd be able to do this. And when you become a supporter, you get all sorts of good stuff. You get ad-free versions of everything we put out. You get the full-length supporter-exclusive midweek show. You get access to our Discord group where there's a lot of fun stuff happening all the time. There's also Politics Guys gear, other benefits at different levels. Like, for instance, we had a number of our supporters and still do. Hey guys, you're still there with us on this episode, offering some comments and commentary that we've incorporated in whenever we could. So that's a benefit as well. So we hope you'll consider checking that out. Just go to patreon.com/politicsguys. You can also support us on Venmo or at Politics Guys or through PayPal. All support links are in the show notes, as well as at politicsguys.com/support. If you want to get that full midweek show, but you are not in a position to financially support us, send me an email, mike@politicsguys.com, and I will get that set up for you. Happy to do that. And of course, if you're a supporter or not, it does definitely help to get the word out. That means if you can rate, review the show on your podcast app, share it on social media, that makes a big difference, and we really appreciate if you do that. And finally, a very special thanks, as always, to our fantastic executive producers, Bruce Johnson, Wilma Moreno, Andra Masker, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, and Don Oglesby. We'll be back with a new episode for you next week. We hope you'll join us.